So just a little bit of context, you know, what we were talking about, and it's an excellent segue from the end of the last panel, because the last question and focus was on, okay, well, how can you achieve diversity and equity and inclusion in IP practice concretely? How can you have real, actual impact? How can you really actually move the needle forward? And I asked professors Chien and Bagley to come and be with us today, because they put together this, no pun intended, but this wonderful innovation, the Diversity Innovators Conference, designed to do just that, to basically look at both existing specific initiatives that have had real impact, and to also provide a forum for new ideas. And when they lay out for you the structure, like particularly the fire starters and the pitches and things of that nature, you see, I'm using these buzzwords just to get you titillated. They're going to lay it out. And in fact, not only because I've worked with them before and I know they always do fantastic stuff, but when they explain the concept, I left my class, flew out, could only be there for about 28 hours, right? Because this was something that I knew I had to be a part of and had to see. So flew out to San Francisco, drove to San Jose, turned around and came back. And it was one of the most well-spent 28, well, not the part of the plane, but the part of the conference, excellent. And so this is what they're going to share with us today.
Thank you so much. Happy birthday to IIPSJ. We're just delighted to be here today. My name is Colleen Chien. I'm from Santa Clara Law School, and I'm going to share about the Diversity Pilots Conference. Next slide. This is a conference we put together with the PTO and with between the two law schools, Emory Law and Santa Clara. And we're just going to get some highlights of that. Next slide. And you can see what we're doing here is really building on work that has been done for at least 20 years, if not more than that. And so we have a lot of partners that we worked with, and IIPSJ was a very important part of that. Also, the PTO is doing work through the Council for Inclusive Innovation, and you have USIPA, Autumn, many of the groups that you are all aware of already. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go to the next slide. This is, yeah, stay on this slide. I'm really excited to be here. Go back one slide, sorry. Because there's not many chances you get to be in the room talking about IP. Last slide for a second. Thanks. Where the word justice is really invoked. And I think we've been talking a little bit about mentoring. I really appreciated Judge Braden talking about the work she's done, all this roles that we can take as individual people, right, in service of others. And as somebody who works in the federal government, I deeply believe in public service. I thank all the public servants that are here, those of you who do work every day to try to mentor and uplift other people. But I think justice is another concept that we really need to grapple with, because the underlying issues that we're dealing with are not just things that can be dealt with on a one-on-one basis. They need to be more systemic. And so that's why I'm excited about the institution building that Lateef has been doing for so long. And really thinking about moving from even justice to enlightened self-interest, because that's when we can really unleash the power of sort of the market to really help us move this forward. So let's go to the next slide. Because it is the end of Black History Month, I do want to spend some time highlighting what I think is a really important backdrop to all of this work, which is to think about these gaps that exist, and in particular talk about the racial wealth gap. And I want to commend to you work of a colleague of mine that I worked with when I was in the Obama administration, Brandon Bouye. He's now a Googler. He runs a very large mailing list on investment. I recommend it to you all. But he wrote a very, very detailed post about understanding the racial wealth gap, using and leveraging a lot of data. I think it's really worthwhile, and I'm going to spend some time talking about it as a motivation. Next slide, please. So a lot of this is, information we might not be, unfamiliar with. And what is presented here is the median household income in 2021. And we see this wealth gap that's very dramatic. And what I think is really important to remember is that this racial wealth gap is as wide in 2023 as it was in 1968, when the Fair Housing Act was signed into law. Next slide, please. When we look at what has happened over time, we've kind of seen the economy move up and down. A lot of people were affected, but when you actually de-average, you see that whites have risen up, beyond their income in 2000. So for the Hispanic families, Black incomes actually went down, right? The 2018 median middle class income, except for Black, it was at an all-time high in 2018, except for Black Americans. And the income hasn't caught up. And so I think this is important to remember, because even if everybody gets a little more, incomes cannot equalize. If we really want to see equality, if we really believe in equality, we can't just give in the same percentage increase, because Black incomes are significantly lower to begin with. Next slide, please. We're going to talk a lot today about the gender gap in innovation and invention. And I think also in the law firm, we often really work on the gender gap. That's important. As a woman of color, I fully applaud those efforts. I think it's still important to remember that the wage gap between Black men and white men is wider than the wage gap between the genders. And so we just, while we work on issues, we need to think intersectionally about the larger picture. And I think, as we put these efforts forward, realizing that things that are going to work for one population aren't necessarily going to work more broadly. Next slide. So what's more striking here is, again, this is all drawing from Brandon's work. I really encourage you all to look at it. I've posted in LinkedIn, and I'm going to tweet some of this out as well. So if you're looking to figure out where the link is, he just posted on LinkedIn. It was something he wrote for his investment group. He didn't post it, but now he's posted it. What we see if we actually break down the occupations is that we see Black workers are disproportionately represented in low occupations today. And I think this is where it starts to get, the intersection with our work really starts to get more concrete. If you go to the next slide, it's very hard to see, but the claim here is that addressing disparities in less than 4% of occupational categories could close more than 60% of the aggregate wage gap. And the number 4 that's listed here is software developers, where we have a huge representation gap and a huge wage gap. So the more we can get a broader representation in STEM in these high wage, great jobs, the more we can really start to approach equality. And I think that's what we're all sort of motivated by. Another couple of statistics that I thought were really striking. Next slide. We're about the kind of gap in terms of unemployment, right? We keep on hearing about unemployment is so tight, and we all see that it's a very tight labor market. But even as unemployment fell at the end of 2020, one noticeable exception was among Black women, who saw their unemployment rate increase from 4.9 to 6.2%. So talking about general trends is not going to work. Next slide, please. And I just want to kind of present his own story, right? He's a Black engineer. He works at Google. And he wrote about his own experience. I'm just going to let his words speak for themselves. So I don't feel like we're going to have a lot of discussion about racism today necessarily, but it's part of the story. It's something we need to grapple with or accept as part of the landscape. So we go to the next slide. On that happy note, I want to shift to what I think is optimistic information, which is about what we've seen in terms of the diversification of the doctors and lawyers over time, right? As the share of doctors and lawyers that were white men declined from 94% in 1960 to 62% in 2010, we know that change is possible. Now, how did that take place? It took place due to greater civil rights, removal of obstacles to human capital accumulation and labor market discrimination. And so when we see that the current composition of inventors is only 12 or 13% women, we don't have to accept that that is where it has to be. Next slide. And for those of us, next slide. So for those of us who are following, back one slide, following the Howard swimming team, I think everyone's like really excited about them. The change is possible, that highlighting successes is exciting. People really want to do that. And I'm hoping that IIPSJ will also be, something that people are really, really rallying behind. It's this, nobody really can be offering what you're doing here, right? I've never been in an IP conference that is as diverse as the ones that you put on. I mean, it's only happening here. So you being in the room and working on this, kudos to everyone here. All right, so let's go to the next slide. I want to move now to thinking about long-term self-interest and why that's so important. Because I think, if we move from a service model to, sort of like, we want to do this because it's out of the good of individual people and, we want to build things that's great, to justice, well, we might also be able to use the force of the law and other sort of tools that we have to our disposal. We want to also move to long-term self-interest and understand what is really the case for diversity in innovation. Why is it so important? Why does it actually matter? Because I think that really will start to unleash the power of the market to help us. All right, so if we go to the next slide here, I'm going to go back to looking at this question of how do we come up with this piloting idea? And what really I want to say about piloting is, we all know change is hard. We think about whatever resolutions we made in January and how do we actually get there? It's really hard, right? So the idea about piloting is that we are rigorous in actually wanting to achieve that goal at the end, and that we're pursuing it really, really with a lot of conviction, right? So if you think about companies, we're all addicted to our phones, right? Every one of us. And part of the reason that is the case is because they use a lot of testing. There's a lot of piloting to say, well, let's try this email, let's try that email, let's try this feed, this post, or this post, and see what she engages in. There's constant testing going on to figure out what is actually going to get you engaged. And I want that same set of passion and set of rigor to go towards also diversifying innovation, right? How do we actually ensure that we deliver? So piloting is really about having a commitment to the end, not just we want to try something or we want to, start this program. It's like, no, do we actually ensure that that person has a better outcome? And we really want to be very intentional about it. So piloting is about intentionality and how to really make that progress. So if you go to the next slide, a lot of the motivation, I think, for this work has come from very basic data. And that's why I spent so much time on the data that Brandon presented. Again, data that a lot of us are familiar with already, but I think he put it together really powerfully. I'm a data person and I'm very motivated by information. So I think it's not, I don't think it's an understatement statement to say that the PTO publishing the statistic that 13% of inventors were women. I mean, that really shocked a lot of us, even though sort of knew that that was the case. That number really was a call to action, and I think spurred a lot of activity that a lot of people here are probably familiar with. Next slide, please. So after this, this report came out, there was this innovation toolkit that came out from IPO. Next slide, please. We did something at Santa Clara, which is put a best practices guide together. I'm happy to have that distributed as much as possible. And there was really this, I think, action explosion. So we're part of that. And again, following Lateef was really at the forefront of this for a long time already. But I think a lot of people look to him for guidance for how do we actually move this forward. But I think now everyone's catching up and starting to focus on this issue. So next slide. I do want to make the case for why pilots are important. So next slide. And I want to talk about this question of why diversity in innovation is important, because I think we take it for granted. We all say diversity is good. We all want that. And I want to specifically talk about the innovation case for diversity as distinct from the moral case. It's the right thing to do. Even the business case, it's good for ESG or other goals. And I want to talk about this empirical case, right? Because I think that's very distinct in the sense of we're not doing it just because it's optically good, or we're not doing it just because we think it's the right thing. No, we're doing it because it's good for our business and it makes us stronger and will make us a better, more robust company on a long term. And I think a lot of companies are embracing this, but I want to talk about this specifically as mapped to innovation. So you go to the next slide. This all comes from a paper that I've written called Redefining Progress, the case for innovation, for diversity in innovation and inventing. And I just want to talk about the fact that there is a lot of really good empirical literature out there about why it's important to have diverse innovators participating. We know that from patent law, these mechanisms are well recognized, that novel ideas are ones that deserve protection, those that represent non-obvious combinations. But when you actually map that to the social science literature, you see that people who are diverse bring diverse insights, they create different products, right? And we've seen the best probably work is about women. When women invent, they innovate for women, not only in terms of different products, but also the same products, but at a higher level of tolerance, or looking at the side effects in a way that's actually going to work for women. Christine Criado Perez has looked at, for example, the fact that most models for crash test dummies are geared towards men's bodies. That makes them unsafe for women. Phones are larger than, is optimal for women because it's, again, designed to a male sort of prototype. So when you have women at the table saying, no, we actually should also do a different test to look at side effects for women, you get better results. Non-obvious combinations, when you have diversity in terms of the thinking, it can bring new conceptual linkages that are very novel. We've a study of 3 decades of PhD theses looking at minority and women PhD candidates. When they were participating, they brought much more innovative ideas to the table. They had these novel conceptual linkages there. Even conflict can be positive. If you can overcome conflict to a point, you avoid groupthink and you induce syntheses which are productive. And finally, this idea of numerosity, right? So sort of the missing Patricia Bass or other, Einstein's, Marie Curie's, pick your favorite inventor. we want to have more of the geniuses out there, and some of them are languishing because they have not been recognized in terms of their talent. Next slide, please. So if we think about the long-term self and like sort of self-interest, next slide. Where this, next slide, please. Where the piloting comes in is trying to think about, let's take a very concrete example, right? I've been talking about this pipeline and just advance through it because it'll show you the different parts of it. Okay, so we talk about, the sort of bookends of people that are in the workforce. We know that 27% of the workforce is women in terms of the STEM workforce, but only 13% of inventors are women. So this is what I call the innovator inventor sort of gap, right? People who are participating, they're in there, they're just not actually patenting. So if we actually break this down mechanically, I have an engineer by training, so I tend to think of these ways: idea, submission, application, prosecution, invention. What can we learn? So next slide, please. And the next slide, yeah, next slide. And so what I've conceived from like pulling data again is that this is a very common phenomena across all of the settings that I looked at, where whether it's big pharma or it's a university or somewhere else, you have this gap between who's actually there, who's like physically in the building, but who's actually inventing. And so this question of who actually is participating is important. Next slide, please. So why do we care then? I kind of made the case earlier for, next slide. Made the case earlier for diversity in invention, but then in innovation, right? We want to get diverse folks into the room to help us innovate better. But then why do we care about invention? Why does it matter that they actually get invention credit? And though this is a very more specific question, I think it's important to think about in terms of the credit, right? If you're at the workforce, but you're not getting credit for your work, that's illegal potentially if you are an inventor, but don't get credited with it. There also can be just people who are innovating, but don't kind of rise to the level of inventor. And then that means we have unequal access, right? So we go back to prosperity that patents can bring, and IP more generally. This gets to the social justice point. It's like bringing in prosperity, you have unequal access to that. But then we go back to this idea that the ideas of diverse innovators may be under commercialized, right? They're not getting those patents, so they're not getting advanced as much as they should be. They're not getting that VC investment, everything that they deserve. So again, next slide. Why do we care about pilots then? Again, because change is hard. We don't know which of many ideas actually works and what we should do at scale, right? Not everything is going to have the same impact. How do we actually scale it? And we want to appreciate that the work of DEI is not a one-off. It's ongoing, iterative, and never complete. So again, here's where I think as an academic, hard evidence is something that I value and think that can really move the needle. Next slide, please. So what is a pilot? The idea here really is to, next slide, is to temporarily introduce something, right? It's like, well, I don't know what to do. There's lots of different ideas there. They cost money. I don't know how to prioritize them. So the idea really is to enable people to take a single step. Take a step, temporarily introduce a change in practice or policy to learn from it. And the goal is not perfection, right? It's just to make incremental progress towards a goal and develop hard evidence of what works. All right, so I'm going to, in the last 5 minutes or so, talk about, if you go to the next slide, some of the pilots that I've been working on with companies and hopefully also with the PTO at some point. Next slide. And this, I want to return to the idea of harvesting how we get ideas, as well as what we can learn from surveys. So next slide, please. Okay, so I know it's hard to see behind there, but this is, this question of putting yourself in the audience like you are right now. You often have to ask, address for yourself the question, should I actually raise my hand when I'm going to ask, like, does anybody have any questions, right? You have to kind of put yourself through that. So if you continue to just scroll through, just press, okay, so the question is, just keep on going with it. So a lot of times, you're sitting there, you're like, well, I don't really have anything to add, or I don't know what, keep going, just keep, yeah, like pushing it and it'll advance it. And then, yes, great, perfect, I'm gonna stop now. So, and then there are other things that will inhibit you from speaking, right? Like, I'm not sure if I have anything interesting to say. And this question fundamentally, do I see myself as someone with innovative ideas comes up? And what we know also from the classroom is that those who participate the most often, all of us as teachers know, aren't the ones that have all the best ideas, right? Some of the good ideas are from the quiet ones that are in the corner. So how do we get there? So next slide. So some of the work we're doing is to leverage this insight that if we ask this question, who has an idea to share, we might have certain people participate. But if we change the framing of how we ask, next slide, or next, yeah, to instead of saying, who has a good idea, instead we go around to everybody and say, well, what are you working on? What's exciting to you? And we ask people individually, akin to putting them on a panel, we get a bit different level of participation in the classroom. And so we wanted to test this in actual settings where we saw that women were not participating, underrepresented minorities were not participating under the standard invention disclosure process. Let's try to shake things up. Next slide. So we're fortunate to work with two companies to actually test this idea that opt-out framing can actually be powerful. In this case, the first one, it was an AI company, and it was lucky because under the pandemic, they had to change the way they did things. Before that, they would go around the attorney and would say, what are you working on? It was akin to the opt-out framing. But once that happened with what COVID happened, he couldn't do that anymore. And so it changed to, whoever has an idea, please submit it through the portal. And we saw next slide. We saw pretty dramatic differences in who participated. A 36 percentage point difference between inventors from underrepresented groups, females, first-time inventors, African American, and Latinx inventors. They're more likely to participate under an opt-out system. Next slide. We tried this again in another setting. Next slide. Where the difference was about how we actually got the ideas. Was it using the portal or was it using these invention harvesting sessions? And we saw again this difference. It wasn't as dramatic, but it's still females were about 5 percentage points more likely to be the lead filers on an invention under this opt-out system. Okay, next slide. I'm going to just run through these really quickly, but you can kind of see the commitment to evidence and information that we have in the work. And we did a lot of work surveying, and I think some of these findings are pretty interesting about inventor identity, right? The same idea of like, am I a person who has something interesting to say? It also really impacts how people see themselves as innovators in the workforce and what actually matters. Next slide. So we see that identity matters a lot. Women statistically are very much statistically significantly less likely to self-identify as inventors, right? And if you think about inventor role models, those that come to mind generally are going to be white men, right? And so we think about, and that's changing, we're working to change that, but 33% of females versus 50% of males at one firm identify as inventors, and we saw that robustly across firms. But then if you change the framing from inventor to problem solver, then that statistical difference disappeared. 88% of females and 89% of males see themselves as problem solvers. So there might be something to leverage there. Next slide. Confidence also matters as well, right? This question on the survey we asked, if you're unsure whether to submit an invention disclosure, what would you do? Women were half as likely as men to submit if they were unsure. They just didn't go forward. And we know there's a big confidence gap, and that is across a lot of realms. It also seems to have a role potentially in innovation. I'm not going to go through the rest of these. Next slide. So then the question comes back to what Lateef asked, like, what do we do about this? How do we actually influence people to have that right, sort of mindset and go for it, and even, in the face of failure? What we saw is, a lot of times companies are thinking, well, should I try a patent award? Should I do, something to make a difference, a famous inventor or something along those lines? And what we're seeing is, again, yes, awards are important. So is that culture. But, if we're thinking about famous inventors versus peers, peers are very important. They're number 4. So if you show how to do it, rather than saying, do it, look, try to be like this person who's really, really amazing. Instead, you say, well, this is how you could do it. Here's a peer. Then attainable role models can be very powerful. Next slide. I think going to a lot of the work that's been done and sort of, consistent with a lived experience, I have this sort of idea that I've written about called invention capital, that it is not equally distributed and your social networks are not as rich, right? And so that it goes to invention as well, even in companies, right? The same company, members of underrepresented groups were less aware of invention processes. They're less likely to have a mentor, and they're more likely to indicate that the culture was not collaborative and that these workplace interactions were inhibiting them in their behavior. And members of underrepresented groups were less likely to believe engaging was a good idea. So next slide. So taking again, I think this research perspective, here are the insights. What do we do about them? Here are some pilots that we're working on with companies to think about social connections and how do we build those up? How do we change it between employees as well as within engineering groups? I'll kind of go forward 2 slides. Again, I think this piloting work is important, and if anybody's interested in sort of on the innovator side or the company side, I'm happy to talk to them. But go to the next slide. You have an initiative to do this work. I do think it's really important still to remember the way that progress was achieved in the the doctor and lawyer space was due to greater civil rights and removals of obstacles to human capital. So we can do piloting, we can try different things. We should always keep an eye towards what policy can do. And informing policy to build social capital. So thinking about the work here is something that then could be incorporated into the law and become the standard. And I want to end with one last quote. Next slide. Here from Ruth Wilson Gilmore. I also do work in the criminal justice system, and she's a prominent abolitionist. And I think the idea here really is when Black Lives Matter, everybody lives better. It's not saying that saying only Black people know what the suffering is. If we can stop, police from killing Black people, other people won't be killed. I think we map that to this space. If we make innovation something that is more, there's more participation from underrepresented minorities, from women, it will become a more inclusive process more generally, and potentially lead to a better outcome. So I'm going to turn it to Margo now to talk about the firm level questions in this piloting process.
Thank you so much, Colleen. Pull up my slides. I was so delighted when Lateef invited us to participate in this wonderful program. I actually participated many years ago, and so glad to finally be invited back again to participate in the IP and social justice. But to talk about the Innovator Diversity Pilots Conference. And for me, it was really eye-opening and amazing. And there's no way that we can present things that that happened, but just to give you some of the highlights. And Colleen has created this whole really area of research about rigorous pilots to increase diversity in the innovation ecosystem. And it really resonated with me as an African-American woman who interacts with the patent system in a variety of different ways. I've been an R&D engineer, co-inventor on 2 patents, patent practitioner with Finnegan, and patent law professor teaching attorneys, future attorneys about patents and how to prosecute and litigate them. But in each of these areas of my life in relation to patents, I'm one of a fairly small number of people who look like me. So I was really thrilled when Colleen invited me to join her on this journey into this area of research. And I learned a lot from the conference, from all of our presenters, the fire starters, the pitches. And I just want to try to give you a sense of some of the initiatives relating to law firm practice in particular that are going on that you might find interesting, that you might be interested in working on towards piloting. Great. So all of the presentations we're going to talk about were on the diversity in the profession and pipeline panel. So that's all what they're going to focus on. And we heard from Karen Stacy, who was the moderator of the panel. She is the CEO of Diversity Lab and a special advisor to the USPTO on diversity, equity, inclusion issues. And she discussed the creation of the On-Ramp Fellowship, which is something that she developed. She, for decades, was responsible for hiring talent for major law firms. And she started to see over time that the traditional characteristics associated with success did not always translate into success in the workforce, where you went to school, for example. And so she started to match behavioral and biographical traits to see, well, what really does influence success, and to apply it in a particular area. And she did like a Moneyball approach to this, and focused on women who had left the practice of law for some period of years in order to raise children. And now we're trying to come back into the field. And that can be very difficult after 10, 20, even 30 years being away from the practice of law. And what she did was create a fellowship, a pilot with 4 firms, Cooley, Baker Botts, Sidley Austin, and Hogan Lovells, who agreed to this 1-year pilot. They would offer a fellowship to a woman who, based on the metrics that Karen had identified for success, this person has some percentage, a high percentage likelihood of being successful in returning to the practice of law. They would hire them for a year, and then after that year, make a decision whether to make them a permanent offer. And the program was very successful and turned into this thing. So she started out with a pilot, a rigorous pilot, and it's now being used by 50 legal departments and firms. They've brought back 200 women back into the practice of law. 20% are patent attorneys, 30% women of color. Sidley alone has had 12 fellows, and at the end of the fellowship offered permanent positions to each of them. And that is an example of a really important and successful and meaningful pilot. So it's continuing to go on. They're expanding it. So far, of all of the participants, 87% who had a fellowship accepted offers after that fellowship. So that's really, really impressive. After Karen, we heard about the Mansfield rule. We heard from Alyssa Caritas at Oric, who was talking about pilots of the Mansfield rule. And this is a rule that's named after Arabella Mansfield, the first woman to be admitted to law practice in the United States. And the idea was a winning idea at the 2016 Women in Law Hackathon, and the idea to make law firm leadership more than a man's field. And this is something that Diversity Labs has also really pushed and piloted in terms of starting out first, the idea, and it came from the Rooney rule, have consider one minority candidate for any leadership position. Well, this was considered one woman, okay, for a leadership position. And it has expanded to considering 30% of women and racial ethnic minorities for leadership, equity partnership, and lateral partnership positions in law firms and legal departments. And you can get a Mansfield certification. You can get a certification plus, which is expanded diversity, as well as actually not just interviewing, but actually achieving certain percentages in those leadership positions. You have to report the data to the Diversity Lab at multiple points in the process. And it's also an annual certification to keep folks from just resting on their laurels and continue through leadership transitions to continue to focus on this rule. And they've had some successes. Before the Mansfield rule, only 12% of surveyed firms and legal departments were even tracking diversity. Now, 100% of 250 firms in the US, UK, and Canada are doing so, as well as 75 legal departments. And it hasn't been that long when you think about it. 2017 was the first pilot. This certification process is important for accountability, but there are other elements of the program that are also good. There are monthly knowledge sharing meetings for participants. There is a focus on transparency. And so that is an additional requirement now in terms of making the requirements for leadership positions, for partnerships, et cetera, clear and transparent. And one of the learnings from the pilots so far is that diversity in leadership composition can also improve diversity through lower levels of an organization and result in more inclusive decisions. More and more firms are joining. I believe each year, 2/3 of current participants have joined in just the past 2 years. And the results are showing upward trends. My clicker's not clicking. There we go. So it's showing upward trends in the compositions of executive teams of firms and organizations that have adopted the Mansfield rule versus non-adopters, as well as less tangible things such as increases in discussions of promotion and what it takes. Oric in particular, where Alyssa was from, went from 38% underrepresented members on the executive committee before implementing the Mansfield rule to 61%. So 38% to 61% in their most recent reporting cycle, and went from 19% underrepresented practice group leaders to 43%. So those are some meaningful numbers. Next, we heard from Piers Blewett, who's with Schwegman, Lundberg, and Wasser. And one of the really interesting things is how many of these things seemed almost organic in terms of the way that they were developed. But he talked about the SLW Academy, which was motivated in part, Colleen talked a lot about racial tensions and issues, but it was motivated by the murder of George Floyd, because SLW's home office is in Minneapolis. And the firm's like, what can we do? We need to do something. And the goal is to increase the representation of underrepresented groups in patent law through educational opportunities geared to high school, college, and law school students. They created a whole series of free videos and quizzes on patents and other really important career information. And what's nice is it's not just, let's see, there we go. Well, go back. There we go, thanks. It's not just substantive. They do have lots of wonderful substantive patent law videos, but then things on career content, like learning from mistakes, which is so important, and being able to apologize, mentoring, all kinds of things that you need to do, or that you need to know in addition to the substantive material in order to be successful. Next, we heard from, and you can go to the website, you can register, and you can look at all of their content for free, and you can recommend it to others. Lateef talked about his pilots, also, of course, this program that we are involved in today, but he also piloted, starting 4 years ago, the IP and Tech Law Summit, which is targeted more to law students. And this second day of programming, which took place yesterday, as I understand it, to expose students to cutting edge legal issues, but also to have the ability to network and to obtain scholarships. So, which would allow them to be able to take perhaps unfunded internship positions that would help enhance the resume and knowledge and experience base, but not put them in a financial crunch. So that is a wonderful pilot that he started and is expanding beyond Howard to 4 of the other 6 HBCUs with law schools, generating more funds for more scholarships, more opportunities. So another wonderful thing about the conference was there were a lot of synergies, and Lateef talked about connecting with Keith Robinson, who had a pitch about exposing undergrads to patent careers, and another pitch about creating consortiums and connecting HBCU law schools with undergrad students to really do more IP education. So we had lots of those kinds of connections coming about, which are great. Lateef also mentioned Michelson IP, another website with lots of free resources. They also provide grants. They're doing a lot of things to, again, enhance and diversify the IP ecosystem. We're also in touch with the folks from Harity, and I did, let's see, yeah, there we go. There it is. This drop-down menu, if you go to their website and click on diversity, there's so many different initiatives that Harity is involved in. And I just wanted to focus on one, and it does relate to the question that was asked at the end of the last panel. That's about patent pathways. How do we increase the pipeline? There are 2 of those, actually. And patent pathways focuses on increasing the number of Black female patent practitioners through training, mentoring, and job opportunities. And it does partner with law firms, with corporations, identifying individual mentors. And that is rolling out. They have some pretty firm timelines, but they are recruiting more potential participants. And it's a very interesting and important pilot that's taking place. Jeremiah Chien from Meta talked about Adapt Legal. And one of the things as Colleen and I have talked to others about this conference is like, we need some sort of a clearinghouse where people can go and find out about all the different initiatives that are taking place. And that's what Adapt is trying to do, advancing diversity across patent teams. It's a hub where you can go and find out information about what various companies and law firms are doing. And one of the initiatives is the patent pipeline. And this was started by a patent attorney who recently joined Meta, but he started it on his own 10 years ago, Braxton Davis. Fascinating. He saw the need, that the pipeline is problematic, and worked on training, not so much to create patent attorneys, but folks who could be technical specialists or patent agents in law firms, and making the connections, providing education, training, and then opportunities in law firms for the participants. They have had their first cohort, I believe, of 3. The next is 8. And they are continuing to expand the program and expand the partnerships. The hub is so great because I found out that Finnegan has an IP university. Who knew? I didn't know that. And so that's one of the great things, finding out what folks are doing. And I encourage those of you, if your firm, if your corporation is doing something in this space, well, the Adapt Hub is a great place to put it so that others can find out. And that's one of the things about the pilots, is encouraging folks to just try something. If it doesn't work, okay, but look at what others have done, learn from those initiatives. And this, Jeremiah shared this great quote from Arthur Ashe: start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. And that's what we're doing. And we encourage you to come pilot with us and come to Emory in 2024, where we're going to have the next Innovator Diversity Pilots Conference. In the meantime, pilot with us. So thank you.
And before we, wait a second, Charlie, before you go get, because I wanted to add a little point to the origin of the HBCU Tech Summit, which many of you were able to attend in person and in Zoom yesterday. And that program grew out of this program because when Charlie Bingham was a student at Howard, he went through this program, as many of the students that are sitting here now helping us to do things. When he then was working in-house at Microsoft, he's the person who conceived of this idea of a program that, instead of the day focusing in on practicing attorneys, how about a sister program for a day focusing in on these types of panels that are directed towards students? And we did the first one at Howard, and initially it was a Howard program, and it was so successful that in the ensuing years, we expanded it. This is how pilots work. And it is now today the HBCU IP and Tech Law Summit. And we have 5 of the 6 HBCU law schools. The only reason why we haven't gotten to the 6th yet is because all the other schools at least had some kind of IP program that we could build upon. UDC is the 6th. They don't yet have a program, but we've got something in the works. And so I wanted you, before you walked out of the room, I want anybody to see how it goes from this to student who then becomes practitioner, who then creates yet another thing as well. And that's the guy who came up with that. And one last thought before we wrap and move, because we've got the next panel coming up. These initiatives can have such an extraordinary impact. And I wanted to mention a different type of initiative. It's just 3 words. The name of the organization is Justice Arts Coalition. Justice Arts Coalition, and you can just Google it. We were talking earlier today about bringing in different cohorts into the IP system. And so we've done work, in fact, a couple of years ago, we did an IP social justice conference in connection with the Professor Darrell Lim, who some of you will see later on a panel we have this afternoon, when he was at the Chicago, the John Marshall Law School in Chicago. He's now at Penn State, but you'll hear more about that later. And that panel, we focused in on various cohorts. We did one panel for Americans with disabilities, getting them into the system, senior citizens, getting them into the system. Justice Arts Coalition, that's a relatively new initiative, been around a few years. Who do they focus in on? Artists who either are or formerly have been incarcerated. Now, these are individuals who have already become accomplished artists during the time of their incarceration, right? And as they were putting their work out, there was a ready market for it. And part of why the coalition came into existence was because you had people out there wanting, how do I get this art? Like, how do I find this guy? How do I pick? Now, putting everything else aside about all the other conversations about incarceration and whatever, the point is we want people who have decided on a productive way to participate in society. We would like them to do that, right? And especially if it doesn't really take any resources from the rest of us. You have discovered you have a vocation, you want to give back, make a contribution, a positive contribution to society, and if it's going to be through through intellectual property, and one of the movies I grew up on was Burt Lancaster and the Birdman of Alcatraz. Someone who was incarcerated and who became fascinated with bird diseases and developed a variety of applications, right? And so you can look them up. And the reason why I mention them is because I happen to know that they currently could use some copyright-oriented pro bono help. And so if you look at them and you're interested, you can either reach out to them directly or you can reach out to me. I got an in with them and we can get you connected. So let me just thank both Professor Colleen Chien and Professor Margo Bagley